12 meters of reinforced concrete cannot drown out the sound of a world screaming. Beneath the ruins of Berlin, the air is a thick, stagnant soup of recycled oxygen, cheap tobacco, and the copper tang of fear. Every few seconds, the ceiling shudders, shedding a fine white dust that settles like snow on maps of a phantom empire. Above, the sky is a bruised purple, choked by the smoke of 1,000 fires. Below, in the fluorescent purgatory of the bunker, the clock is ticking toward a 0 hour that no one dares to name, yet everyone feels in the vibration of their teeth. This is not a fortress, it is a tomb waiting for its occupants to realize they are already dead. The man at the center of this subterranean labyrinth is no longer the titan who once held a continent in a grip of iron. He is a flickering candle in a drafty room. His left hand is a separate entity now, trembling with a violent, rhythmic persistence that he tries to crush by pinning his arm against his ribs. His eyes, once described by followers as hypnotic, are clouded with the milky film of exhaustion and the frantic calculations of a cornered animal. He paces the narrow corridors with a dragging shuffle, his spine curved as if the weight of the falling city above is resting directly on his shoulders. He is a prisoner of his own shadows, surrounded by men who are already transitioning from allies into ghosts. The atmosphere is a surreal collision of military precision and the chaotic despair of a sinking ship. In the communications room, the frantic clatter of teletype machines continues, spewing out reports of divisions that have been wiped off the map and armies that exist only in the fevered dreams of the high command. Officers stand stiffly, their uniforms immaculate but their faces sallow and hollowed out by sleeplessness. They speak in whispers, not out of respect, but out of a shared terror that the walls have ears. Loyalty has become a currency that has lost all its value, and every man in the bunker is silently calculating the distance between the steel doors and the approaching Soviet line. The conflict inside these concrete walls is more visceral than the artillery fire shaking the foundations. It is a psychological war of nerves. Information arrives in jagged fragments, a crackling radio broadcast from a neutral capital, a desperate telegram from a general who is already dead, or a mud-splattered messenger who has crawled through the rubble of the Tiergarten. Each update is a fresh blade. When word reaches the inner sanctum that one of his oldest, most trusted subordinates has attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the enemy, the explosion is not one of shock, but of a cold, vitriolic fury. The realization that the circle is shrinking from the inside out is the final blow to the structure of authority. The betrayal feels more real than the burning city. Life in the bunker has become a theater of the grotesque. While the citizens above starve and fight over scraps in the ruins, the inhabitants of this concrete hole try to maintain a mockery of normalcy. Meals are served on fine porcelain, even as the lights flicker and the ventilation system hums a low, morning drone. Secretarial staff sit at their typewriters, fingers flying over the keys to produce orders for counterattacks that will never happen, directed at generals who have long since abandoned their posts. It is a performance play to an empty house, where every actor knows the theater is on fire and the exits are barred from the outside. Among the shadows moves a woman who has chosen this terminal loyalty. Eva Braun spends her hours in a small, cramped room, her presence a bizarre anchor to a personal life that the man in charge discarded decades ago. While others look for poison or a way to slip through the sewer lines, she paints her nails and listens to records, her laughter echoing unervingly through the damp hallways. She is the only person who doesn't seem to be waiting for a miracle, she is waiting for the end, and she is determined that it will be an event of her own design. Her calm is more terrifying than the panic of the generals. By the early morning of April 29th, the sounds of the front line have moved from the suburbs into the very heart of the government district. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the Katyusha rockets, the Stalin organs, vibrates through the massive slabs of the ceiling, a relentless percussion that marks the passage of time. The inner circle has stopped pretending. The frantic planning sessions have been replaced by long, heavy silences and private consultations with doctors. The primary topic of conversation is no longer strategy, but chemistry. They discuss the efficiency of cyanide capsules versus the reliability of a service pistol with the same detached clinical tone they once used to discuss troop movements. In a cramped map room, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 failed campaigns, a brief and somber ceremony takes place. It is a marriage, a legal formality performed in a tomb. The air is heavy with the scent of old paper and ozone. Immediately following the ceremony, the man who shaped the destiny of millions sits down with his youngest secretary, Trottel Junge, to dictate his final will and testament. There is no admission of guilt in his voice, no reflection on the millions of lives extinguished in his name. Instead, he speaks with a flat, delusional clarity, reiterating the same rhetoric that fueled his rise, framing his total collapse as the result of a grand betrayal by those who were not worthy of his vision. The following day, April 30th, the bunker turns into a clinical waiting room for death. The Soviet forces are now only a few hundred meters away, fighting through the wreckage of the Chancellery Garden. The sound of small arms fire can be heard echoing down the ventilation shafts. A final meal of pasta and cabbage is shared in a state of suspended animation. The man who once commanded the world makes his rounds, shaking hands with the remaining staff, nurses, cooks, and clerks who have stayed because they had nowhere else to go. There are no grand speeches left, only the quiet, hollow recognition of a shared conclusion. Shortly after the midday meal, the central figures retreat to their private quarters. The heavy iron door closes with a definitive, metallic thud, leaving the rest of the bunker's inhabitants in a terrifying silence. For a time, the only sound is the hum of the machinery and the distant, muffled roar of the bombardment. Then, a single sharp noise cuts through the air, a sound that signals the definitive conclusion of an era. When the door is finally opened, the scene is exactly as it was prepared. The man and his new wife are gone, having chosen a path that ensures they will never be displayed as trophies by the approaching army. What follows is a scene of hurried, frantic desperation. In accordance with strict instructions, the remains are carried up the narrow stairs to the small garden area outside the bunker's emergency exit. Under a sky blackened by smoke and illuminated by the flashes of incoming shells, a final, clumsy ritual is performed. Gasoline is poured over the evidence of their end, and as the shells fall around them, a few remaining guards stand in the wind, watching the flames rise. It is not a dignified exit, it is a panicked attempt to erase the physical reality of a man who had become a god to some and a demon to the world. With the central figure gone, the bunker's internal discipline dissolves instantly. The remaining inhabitants, the secretaries, the officers, the guards, face a choice between two different kinds of death. Some follow the path of their leader, unable to envision a world without the regime that had consumed their lives. Others decide to take their chances in the ruins, discarding their uniforms and melting into the chaos of the city. The bunker, once the nerve center of a vast empire, becomes a hollow, echoing shell filled with discarded documents, half-empty bottles of schnapps, and the lingering, acrid scent of chemicals and smoke. The fall of the bunker was not just a military event, it was the psychological collapse of a vision that had tried to remake the world in its own twisted image. In those final hours, the grand delusions were stripped away by the reality of a small, damp room underground. The paranoia that had driven the leadership to the depths of the earth had finally consumed them entirely. As the first Soviet soldiers tentatively entered the complex, they found not a palace of power, but a cluttered, claustrophobic basement where the remnants of a nightmare had finally faded into the dark. Today, the site of the bunker is buried beneath a nondescript parking lot and an apartment complex in the heart of Berlin. There are no monuments to what happened there, only a simple information board that tells the story of the darkness that once dwelt beneath the surface. The story of those final hours is one of a man who climbed to the highest peaks of power only to end in the deepest hole imaginable, surrounded by the ghosts of his own creation and the ruins of his ego. It remains a stark reminder of the ultimate cost of a life lived in total defiance of humanity. The tragedy of those final days was felt most by those who had no choice but to be there, the civilians caught in the crossfire and the soldiers ordered to fight for a cause that was already dead. Their stories provide the true scale of the horror, a scale that the man in the bunker could never comprehend. As the smoke cleared over the wreckage of the chancellery, the world began to grasp the extent of the devastation that had been orchestrated from that concrete tomb. The secrets it held were finally exposed to the harsh light of a new, fractured world. In the end, the dark thriller of the bunker is a study of how absolute power, when disconnected from truth and compassion, inevitably creates its own prison. The heavy steel doors, the reinforced walls, and the deep earth were not enough to keep out the consequences of the choices made. The final hours were not a climax of glory, but a slow, cold descent into the reality of an ending that had been written long before the first shell hit the roof. The silence that eventually filled those concrete corridors was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a void where a terrifying force had once resided, leaving behind nothing but ash and the memory of the dark.